Great to see your bright and shining faces all over America this morning. Thank you so much for joining us here at Online Home Church. We appreciate it as we celebrate near the end of the liturgical calendar. Today is the 26th Sunday after Pentecost, which means it was almost exactly 6 months ago that in May we were celebrating the tongues of fire landing upon the top of the apostles' heads, them beginning to speak in tongues and thus taking the gospel out around the world, the ancient world, so that the people around them could understand the good news that Jesus had brought salvation to so many who believed in him. And so we have a lot to discuss today based on the readings that we just heard from Ree and from Martha, and greatly appreciate both of y'all reading this morning because as you can tell from both the Psalm, the lesson from Daniel, and even the letter to the Hebrews, there's this notion throughout our readings today, and really all of Christian theology, that we are preparing for this day to come when Jesus will come again in glory and with angels to judge those who are living and dead, as we say in the Nicene Creed every Sunday, and ultimately end up in the kingdom of heaven. But you see, it all starts with a certain day that Jesus portends here in the gospel lesson we just read. And Christians for 2,000 years have been wondering when that day will come, with various predictions, various prophecies, and various ways to kind of say, well, this must be it. And Jesus warns us in the gospel lesson today that there were many who will come in my name, but you have to be wary of them. And so it was no accident then, I think, as I was reading the news this morning, that NBC News had just kind of an interesting one-off article about a giant fish that came ashore in Encinitas, California. But I thought it was noteworthy given the topic of our lessons today, and in particular, Jesus' message to us in the Gospel of Mark. You see, there's this picture on NBC News, an article that I saw this morning, but I guess came out yesterday morning, about an oarfish. That's all one word if y'all want to search that later in your web browser. An oarfish that landed in Encinitas, California, washed ashore from the deepest parts of the Pacific Ocean. The oarfish is very rare. In fact, rarely studied by biologists and oceanographers because it lives somewhere in the depths of the Pacific Ocean. Typically, the scientists have concluded that the oarfish lives somewhere around 3,000 feet below the surface. So this is a very unique animal, one that is rarely studied, and one that ultimately is so unique that the good people of Encinitas who found it washed ashore took their picture with it. And so when you pull up this picture from NBC News, you'll see 15 people holding this thing that looks like a giant eel out of a movie. And in fact, it does look kind of gross, or something that Hollywood would have created. It's big on the end, enough that people are really kind of struggling under the burden, and then slopes down as the number of people still continues, but the tail of the oarfish is held up. So why are we talking about the oarfish in church? Well, because the article is an interesting turn of phrase in the title of the article. It describes the oarfish as a harbinger of doom. A harbinger of doom. Why? Well, it turns out that these oarfish are so rare, and we only get a chance to see them when they wash ashore, but they only wash ashore at certain times, namely before earthquakes and tsunamis. The last time we had a big, humanity, had a big sighting and chance to observe oarfish on the Pacific Ocean was on the big island in the Japanese islands, where 20 or so oarfish washed ashore about 15 years ago, and that preluded the big earthquake and tsunami that ultimately killed 15,000 people in Japan back in 2011. So since then, the oarfish has kind of gotten this rep as a harbinger of doom, and so the NBC News article was quick to conclude, well, what does it mean for us? There are many who are looking at this time in human history with the conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine, the conflict going on between Israel and certain groups in the Middle East, as a sign that, as Jesus mentioned, there will be nation against nation. There will be famines like we have consistently in Africa over the last 30 years. So is this it? And now this oarfish washing ashore last week in Encinitas, California is one more kind of brick in the wall that many people are looking at as a harbinger of doom. Where does all this come from? Well, in our gospel lesson today from Mark, Jesus is walking with the apostles through Jerusalem. And one of them takes the time, Mark says, to just stand there and look. I mean, these are fishermen. These are agricultural workers who Jesus has gathered into this group of 12 apostles so that they can carry the good news around the Sea of Galilee and Judea and other parts surrounding that area, like the Decapolis as you head over to Syria and cross the River Jordan. But ultimately, these guys are fishermen and farmers. And so when they're in Jerusalem looking at the mighty temple, which stood at least 4 stories tall, I'm sure they were amazed, just like many of us who go to New York City tend to stand there and stand on the sidewalk and look up at the skyscrapers and just marvel in awe. And so when one of the apostles says, well, Jesus, look at these big stones and these mighty buildings. Isn't this something? Jesus' response is a harbinger of what is to come. And one of the reasons that Jesus is, even among Jews today, known as a great prophet, because he said, look at all these big stones and look at these buildings. Not one will remain. All will be thrown down. Now, there's 2 reasons this is in part of our gospel lesson today, everybody, as we turn the page in our liturgical calendar. The first is theological. The second is historical. The theological point of Jesus saying all will be thrown down with the temple is that his death, resurrection, and ascension all ultimately destroyed the temple culture. So that we as followers of Jesus, who ultimately end up reading the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles and all the letters from Paul and James to the early Christian communities, recognize that the law of Moses and the Torah, which everyone worshipped in those days and followed in those days, including Jesus and his apostles, was built around a culture in the temple in Jerusalem that ultimately was going to be destroyed in a theological way. Because as the letter of Hebrews tells us this morning, and as so eloquently read, it ultimately doesn't have anything to do with the law. It has to do with what's in your heart. And Jesus died on the cross for our salvation. It doesn't have anything to do with us washing utensils and observing the Sabbath in a particular manner or eating a particular kind of food. Everything that matters is in our heart. And everything that mattered was Jesus' death on the cross. And so when he died on the cross and came back 3 days later, he saved us all from sin. And when he predicts the destruction of the temple, he's not just talking about the building itself. What he's talking about is the new way to worship God. Just as it says in the Psalms this morning, we keep the glory of God in our hearts, and we recognize that God is our lot and our portion, that he gives us a cup that ultimately is overfilled with abundance. And we know that because Jesus died for us. He gave his life so that we may all have eternal life. So Jesus is kind of calling the shot, as they say in baseball. He's pointing out to the outfield fence and saying, you know what's going to happen? This is all going to be destroyed. And ultimately, it all comes down to what the relationship is between you and God. But one of the reasons that today, even 2,000 years later, many people in the Jewish religion still look at Jesus as a prophet and a good man, is that what he said was also historically true. You see, Jesus walked the earth somewhere between 0 AD, or a little bit before the years that we measure now as before Christ. And his death is somewhere between 30 and 33 as we measure in the modern calendar. But we know precisely that within 37 years of his death, if he died in the year 33, that in the year 70 AD, or 70 years after he was born, that the emperor of Rome, Nero, committed suicide. Nero was a lunatic. He was ultimately responsible for burning down much of Rome. He treated his people horribly, and the good people of Rome, such as there were at that time, were glad to see him go. But as so often the case in the Roman Empire, and really many governments and nations that are run in this manner, the people of Rome had civic unrest and near chaos, anarchy, once Nero died. And so it wasn't long before the new emperor, Vespasian, came into power, tried to consolidate Rome around him and his followers, and ultimately kind of restored peace. But Vespasian was looking for some way to kind of rally the people around his new government and his new position on the throne. And so Vespasian, as so many rulers of so many countries over human history have said, we need a win. And the best way for us to get a win is to go out and have our people thinking of what's going outside of Rome, not the turmoil within. And it was easy for Vespasian to find his target for a win for the Roman Empire. You see, in 66 AD, 2 different groups of Jewish rebels in the city of Jerusalem had had enough. Jesus' time and his ministry in Galilee were very much marked by the time and presence and context of where he lived and where he preached. And as we know, his death ultimately on the cross was ordered not by the high priest Caiaphas, but by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor in place at the time. And so the rebellion against Roman authority was always on the minds of the Jews during Jesus' time and after. And so those 40 years after Jesus died, came back to life and ascended into heaven were one of continued turmoil in Jerusalem and violence between the people of Israel and Rome. Finally, enough was enough, and two groups of Jewish rebels in the year 66 led a revolt that kind of, what's the right word? It smoldered for 3 years. Jerusalem was in turmoil. The Romans didn't quite quash the rebellion. They just kind of let it go and had a stalemate for 3 years. But when Nero died and Vespasian took over, enough was enough. Vespasian sent his son Titus, who ultimately was to become the next emperor of Rome. He sent Titus down to Jerusalem from Rome with 4 legions of Roman soldiers. And in the summer of the year 70, those Roman soldiers came into Jerusalem and demolished it, even more completely than Nebuchadnezzar did in 587, where he dragged off many of the Jewish leaders into exile in Babylon and chained them into Babylon for a good 3 generations. Here, the Romans had had enough, and they very much treated Jerusalem like they did Carthage. They burned every building. They destroyed every stone. The temple that Jesus, during his ministry and in our gospel lesson today in Mark, was completely thrown down and not one stone remained. The verb that the Romans used was raze, R-A-Z-E, and they razed Jerusalem so that no inhabitant could remain. Every single bit of that city was destroyed, and in fact, for the next 150 years or so, every Roman record referred, bless you, every Roman record referred not to Jerusalem, but to a Latin term that they used to coin where Jerusalem used to be. Completely devastated. And so as a result, the Jewish religion had to modify itself. The temple culture that they had built up, not only in the first temple, which was destroyed in 587 by the Babylonians, but now the second temple has been destroyed. The Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant and this whole culture of the high priest was completely obliterated. And as a result, Jews spread out all over the ancient world. And ultimately, many of them became Christians because it was this destruction of the temple in 70 AD that many in the Christian religion look at as the catalyst for Mark, the gospel we're reading today, to be written. And so when you go look at the first verses of the Gospel of Mark, which we've been studying for the past year, you'll notice that the beginning is something to the effect of the good news according to Jesus Christ. And so it was only with the destruction of the temple and the Romans had enough that Mark looked back at the sayings and writings that all had gathered from the apostles and said, we need to put this down in writing. So Mark wrote the first of the 4 Gospels historically, and the catalyst for that was the destruction of the temple in Rome, because he realized what Jesus had said time and time again, that these stones will be thrown down and this temple will ultimately be destroyed, was not only historical prophecy that was the kind of the spur for him to begin writing the gospel, but theologically true. So let's take a look as we conclude our discussion today of the temple culture and Jesus being a harbinger of doom to the letter from the Hebrews. What does it mean for us sitting here the 2 weeks before Thanksgiving in 2024? It's good to know this history of Jesus, the Jews who rebelled, and the Romans who ultimately not just put down the rebellion, but destroyed the city of Jerusalem. It's good for us to know that. But what does it mean for us in terms of how we act? Well, I love the last line of the verses that we read for us today. And that is that Christians who follow Jesus and have put aside the temple culture, who've put aside this formality of worship that the Jews, including the Sadducees and Pharisees, who ultimately led to Jesus' death, we put aside all of that and focus on what's in our hearts and in our minds. And in the letter to Hebrews today, we hear that. Focus on what's in your hearts and minds and be an advocate. Be an advocate to do good deeds to each other, to love one another as Christ loved us. That, after all, was his 2 great commandments to us. Put God above all others, love God above all else, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so when you get a chance today, I encourage you to go back and look at that last line from Hebrews, because it's a good set of marching orders, especially these 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. And so for those of you who like to count days before Christmas, we're coming up on just about 6 weeks before Christmas. The liturgical calendar is turning. The weather is changing. Christmas trees are coming up all over the country. And I hope that you'll put a spring in your step as you think about the coming of the Lord in his second judgment day, or in his judgment day, whenever that turns out to be. But in the meantime, don't be too focused on harbingers of doom. I mean, if we were to look at this past week's event, what's a bigger harbinger of doom, the oarfish or the fact that 65 million people got on Netflix to watch Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson, including, I'm sure, some people right here in our congregation this morning. When you talk about nation against nation and kingdoms against kingdoms, watching these two try and fight it out in the Cowboys, in 8 rounds in the Cowboys stadium was like, oh boy, is this the end of our civilization or just yet another stunt to improve a streaming service? Either way, it's fair to look back at this and say, you know what, it doesn't really matter what all of the harbingers of doom are in our life, as long as we focus on the relationship between us and God through his Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, and loving our neighbors as Jesus